Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, Navigating the New Normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and the economy, real estate and medicine, technology and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 National American Charitable Organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission in this free public affairs program with a donation of any amount. Visit us, American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, online and donate at afrmc.org. Join us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. We depend on our audience's support to help the hospital in Israel. So thank you if you can contribute any amount. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is free speech in an age of disinformation. Thank you to our very special guests, Professor Laurence Tribe of Harvard Law School, Professor Jelani Cobb, Dean of Columbia Journalism School, and Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. Our subject today is free speech in an age of disinformation. We live in times when social media permit just about anyone to disseminate information and disinformation in volume and at speeds unheard of even a generation ago. Nazis, purveyors of bizarre and hateful theories, white supremacists, anti-Semites, propagate their ideas in the same space as stories and arguments that pass tests of editing or reason or even sanity. Does this free realm for the QAnon followers and the Alex Joneses, the advocates of racial replacement theory or the big lie that the election of 2020 was stolen, does it threaten our commitment to free speech? Does it make us rethink what the present day equivalent is of the old hypothetical alarmist who shouted fire in a crowded theater? Well, for those questions and many others, we've assembled, I think, a very interesting panel. And our first panelist is Laurence Tribe. Laurence Tribe's name is virtually synonymous with constitutional law. He is now University Professor of Constitutional Law Emeritus at Harvard. His writing and advocacy over the years cover everything from the First Amendment to the 14th. He has argued more than 30 cases before the Supreme Court, and he's author of a famous treatise on constitutional law as well. Larry Tribe, thank you very much for taking part with us today.
Thank you, Robert. It's my pleasure.
I'd like to start with the premise that despite a long, sad history of odious groups and individuals in American history, there is some combination of their greater acceptance on the far right and the new media at their disposal to make this time a little different and oblige us to think about how we respond to hateful disinformation? Or do you see it as not such an unusual time?
No, I see it as an extremely unusual and threatening time. I mean, for a while, it looked like the capacity of anyone to express a view and to become her own publisher was a great promise. It really suggested that the marketplace of ideas could really be open not only to established publishers and institutions, but to all of us. But it really wasn't very long before that promise, I think, was overcome, at least in my perception, by a sense of peril, because the cacophony of voices, each of which could reach massive audiences, unheard of in the past, at remarkable speeds, audiences that could then create and curate their own silos so that they would hear echoes of what they already believed. All of that transformed the situation into one that I think requires us to rethink the parameters of free speech and the ways in which it can both encourage democracy and endanger democracy. Democracy with a small d and republicanism with a small r, the sense of representative self-government.
Well, what kind of rethinking have you been doing? Are there things that you thought for sure about free speech and limits to inflammatory speech a few years ago that you don't think anymore, or new ideas that you have?
Well, it's happened gradually. I, some years ago, gave the keynote address to a group called the Electronic Freedom Foundation, an address that I think I called The Constitution in Cyberspace. And I elaborated the view that the key thing is not to allow new technologies to obliterate old boundaries. That is, to formulate our views, both of privacy and of expression, in terms that were impervious to technological change, so that electronic eavesdropping, even though it didn't involve any trespass, was nonetheless subject to Fourth Amendment constraints. Mm-hmm. And the public square, even though it might be invisible, and even though it might take the form of a social medium, was nonetheless the public square. And if owned and directed by government, had to obey governmental rules. I haven't really changed those fundamental views, mm-hmm. but the danger that I see is one that requires us to examine questions about libel, questions about lying, questions about disinformation, in terms that are really no longer limited to the old fire in a crowded theater model. The idea that under the old Brandenburg test, if you advocate violence, that's fine as long as you don't incite imminent violence. I think we have to rethink some of that when the advocacy sets fire, not in a crowded theater, but in a universe where there are more and more violent actors who need only a spark in order to enact their hateful nightmares and visions.
I've I guess ever since the hearings into what happened on January 6th, been thinking about what incitement is and how it's different from giving a fiery speech and some lunatic going off and doing something. At this time, although I can't say that if somebody claims that liberal elites and Democrats are running a pedophile ring out of a pizzeria in Washington, that will result in a violent act. I'm no longer surprised that outrageous comments like or positions like that one, most recently that the federal government was behaving like the Gestapo when it searched Donald Trump's home. It no longer surprises me as a citizen that somebody puts on combat gear and goes off and, in this case, tries to attack the FBI. It isn't a one-to-one. It's not I could identify something that you say or something that you write that will lead to violence or incite violence. But given the breadth of audiences, I don't know about you, but I don't feel any surprise in the connection between these ideas being expressed and violence that follows.
I don't either. There's an increasing chasm between surprise and shock. A lot of things that are shocking are no longer surprising. It does seem to me that we have to look at the architecture of the internet. the algorithms that are used in order to bring violent content to the surface. Shoshana Zuboff is an important theorist, and her book, Surveillance Capitalism, focuses on the algorithms that some of these social media outlets use. And it seems to me that we have to focus on possibilities of regulatory action which do not censor the content of what is being communicated, but focus on the business model and on the algorithm that makes it increasingly likely, sort of in a stochastic sense, even though not in a one-to-one sense, increasingly likely that violence will percolate to the surface and that lies will propagate themselves and become viral more rapidly than any biological virus, and in ways that really give the lie to the idea that the truth can ultimately prevail. The whole image, the whole idea of rational discourse and of truth prevailing in the marketplace of ideas, I think, presents us with a metaphor that is increasingly out of touch with the reality that we have to come to terms with.
Is part of the problem? This isn't a very traditional defense of the First Amendment, but that the idea that indeed gatekeepers are actually beneficial in the marketplace. That some standard to get into the marketplace and sell is in the past was effectively there, and no longer is, and we're reaping the benefits of freedom, alas.
Well, as long as the gatekeepers do not themselves become the sort of the Gestapo, as long as we don't have an all-powerful government manning all the gates and deciding who are permissible speakers, it seems to me that decentralization is important. That, for example, the possibility of massive libel verdicts against the Alex Joneses of the world, without any central authority deciding as a kind of commissar of truth what is or is not permissible. I think that encourages me. It seems to me that if it's a jury of one's peers that decides what is recklessly false or deliberately injurious, we are safer than if we allow any central authority to make those decisions. That is the kind of variable that I think we need to focus on as we build a new architecture of free speech.
Alex Jones has over $50 million in judgments against him for having propagated the notion that the parents of the children at Sandy Hook Elementary School were all making it up with the government, and that there hadn't really been mass murder, and they sued and actually won by default, and then won this award. But it's 10 years since they lost their kids at Sandy Hook, and since Alex Jones started going on about this, and the size of the judgment may hold up on appeal or may not hold up on appeal. It doesn't. I don't know what to replace it with, but it doesn't feel like the most ironclad defense against people pulling an Alex Jones.
Certainly not ironclad, but it may be that it establishes a precedent that makes the next case and the case after that move more rapidly. That is, it may be that initially establishing the proposition that someone like Alex Jones can be driven out of business, driven into bankruptcy as a result of lies for which he thought he would never be held accountable, will make Alex Jones prime and Alex Jones the third a little more reluctant to cause the kinds of damage that he caused. It's not in and of itself a completely wonderful solution. Because I don't think that old models of tort law are necessarily going to solve our problem. But I think this is an area where I think happily the Supreme Court, which is going to inevitably weigh in our system of government importantly on what the boundaries are is not going to be sort of predictably divided so that all of the justices that I at least think of as on the far right will be in the way of progress. Justice Alito, for example, the author of the, I think, horrific Dobbs decision that threatens to make the world of the Handmaid's Tale the world that we live in, Justice Alito has taken
the Mississippi
positions
abortion
about
law,
the danger of lies and of deliberate infliction of emotional distress that I think are in many ways more progressive and more encouraging than opinions by people with whom I otherwise would more normally agree. So I think this is an area where the standard lines may get shaken up a bit, and I think that's encouraging.
If in fact defamation lawsuits are the most effective way of discouraging calculated and hurtful lies in digital space, can that law work by its current standard, which makes it very difficult to be held liable for defaming someone who is, and you make sure I'm getting the noun right, is it a public official or a public figure? Because just about everyone's a public figure now. I mean, the internet has made everyone a public figure.
A celebrity.
And cable television has made everyone a public figure.
Difficult, but not impossible. Deliberate and reckless falsehood, which can be proved. Deliberate and reckless falsehood that injures people's reputation can be made actionable. And there is the possibility of looking back at history for examples of laws punishing group libel, libel of an entire race or class, statements that all Blacks are inferior or that Jews are subhuman. The Supreme Court in 1952, in a case from Illinois that has never literally been overruled, has said that one can pass laws making that kind of libel impermissible. The United States, unlike other countries, has typically said that Holocaust deniers and others who propagate lies about whole groups of people are immune from regulation. That may no longer be possible in a world where that kind of group libel can again stir up horrible genocidal action.
You've referred to a decision of the Supreme Court that when we spoke last week in preparation for our interview, I was unfamiliar with. You told me about it, Beauharnais versus Illinois, which indeed effectively granted Illinois the right to have the sort of European laws that you're talking about. Is part of your rethinking going back to the early 50s to the Beauharnais standards?
To some extent. I mean, I certainly haven't reached kind of any bottom line about that, but Justice Frankfurter had a good bit to say in that case that I think merits consideration. I don't always agree with Felix Frankfurter about free speech. I thought he was wrong in the cases involving mandated salute to the flag and mandated pledges of allegiance. I think he missed the boat there, and that Justice Jackson was right. But at least in my own thinking, I don't regard anything as off the table any longer.
Because of your sense of what the consequences are today and what's different about
exactly. Because the consequences are different qualitatively and not just quantitatively, and because they go to the very structure of democracy. I mean, the lie that elections are stolen, when sufficiently propagated, undermines faith in the electoral process. That in turn makes it easier to have a successful coup or an insurrection, perhaps a bloodless one or a violent one. And the underpinnings of representative government really cannot survive that kind of systemic boundless lying. And that's what we are beginning to live through, I'm afraid.
Well, Professor Laurence Tribe of Harvard, stick with us. We should come back in a few moments when we have our discussion and Q&A session. Jeffrey Rosen is a constitutional scholar who has been president and CEO of the National Constitution Center since 2013. The center, by the way, is a nonpartisan education center in Philadelphia devoted to the Constitution of the United States, and I believe chartered by the Congress. He has written for The Atlantic, The New Republic, The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine. He also was certainly in my day no stranger to NPR. We logged quite a few hours together, and we're very happy to have him here with us today. Jeff Rosen, thanks for taking part.
Great to see you, Robert, and great to be here with Professor Tribe.
And let's start with the overall question that we're addressing today. Given the prominence that disinformation enjoys via modern social media, should we be rethinking at all our understanding of the limits of free speech?
I don't think so. I listened with great interest to your discussion with Professor Tribe, who's so thoughtful about these questions. But I am talking to you from in front of a fake backdrop. I'm not actually at the National Constitution Center, but the picture behind me is of the First Amendment tablet that we recently installed here at the NCC. And this is 50 tons of marble, 75 feet high. It used to hang at the museum building in Washington, D.C., but it's come to the National Constitution Center and is the words of the First Amendment shining in this beautiful space overlooking Independence Hall, where the Constitution and Declaration of Independence were drafted. And when I dedicated this magnificent tablet a few months ago, I had the occasion to reflect about why we protect free speech. And there are two meaningful documents I talked about. Thomas Jefferson's Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom in Virginia and Louis Brandeis's concurrence in Whitney versus California. Brandeis read Jefferson and tracked closely Jefferson's 4 reasons for protecting free speech. And you talked about one of them with Professor Tribe, and that was the importance of encouraging political participation and protecting democracy. And you also talked a bit about the second reason, which is that uninhibited public debate is necessary for the discovery and spread of political truth. There are 2 other reasons that Jefferson and Brandeis mention. One is the need to hold public officials to account to ensure that we, the people, and not our representatives, have the final word. The first reason, which closely links the Declaration of the Constitution, is the importance of freedom of conscience. And Jefferson and Brandeis talked about freedom of conscience as a natural right that comes from God or nature, not from government. And Jefferson talked about why it's impossible to control people's thoughts and to meaningfully suppress their speech, even if you want to. And that's because the opinions of men, and these are Madison's words in defending Jefferson, being dependent on the evidence contemplated by their own minds cannot be controlled by other men. In other words, I can't surrender or alienate to you or to Professor Tribe the power to control my thoughts because I can't entirely control them myself. They're the product of the evidence presented to my reasoning mind. And this shimmering Enlightenment faith, which just pervades the entire Constitution and the Declaration, is indeed based on a faith in reason, and that it is that individuals have a right and a responsibility to cultivate our faculties of reason, and efforts by the government or by any authority to control our reason will ultimately fail. And I still plant my flag on that faith in reason, despite the grave challenges posed by new technologies, which have indeed sped up the speed of deliberation in ways that the founders couldn't have anticipated, and also dramatically expanded the scope and scale of false speech or angry or fractious speech. Still, the individual mind will be free, and efforts to control it, in addition to being illiberal and unconstitutional, are likely to be ineffective. So, there's much more to say about all of these 4 reasons and whether or not we should rethink them in light of new technologies. But in the end, my sense is that I'm going to continue to stick with the Jeffersonian faith.
I read an interview. The interview was a couple of years old, but I just read it with Ira Glaser, who was head of the American Civil Liberties Union for many years, and before that, head of the New York Civil Liberties Union. It was during that time that the famous Skokie march was planned. This was a kind of small neo-Nazi group wanted to go protest in a town that was largely Jewish and was home to a few hundred Holocaust survivors. And the Skokie, the town, and I believe the state tried to put up various legal barriers to the march. Those were thrown out by the court. In the end, the opposition to the Nazis was so strong that there was a larger protest in Skokie against the Nazis than the small march that had been moved to Chicago, very small, that the neo-Nazis took. During that time, a lot of people quit the American Civil Liberties Union for its support of the Nazis' right to protest in Skokie and to put free speech ahead of the sentiments of those in the town. It occurred to me, thinking back on what's different now. I mean, Ira Glaser in the interview said he didn't think the ACLU would do the same thing today, that confronted with the same problem, they would not be as courageous and in defense of the First Amendment, in his view. I thought a big difference is that when we thought of not even the American Nazi Party of 1997, but a breakaway fringe group of the American Nazi Party in 1977, we thought about a group that we had recently defeated in a world war, and that was not embraced by either major political party and was pretty far out there and not likely to take power in the United States. Also, I mean, if we're going to be honest about this, we support their right to free speech with the understanding that the FBI is monitoring their behavior if it threatens violence, perhaps using informants within their ranks to learn what they're up to and possibly even infiltrating them. Can we reconcile that with a commitment to free speech, which is to say, okay, you white supremacists, you neo-Nazis, you can say your piece and publish whatever you want, but we've got you. You know, the law enforcement has got you covered.
Robert, the most significant thing you just said is that the ACLU would no longer support the Nazis' right to march.
That was Glaser's. That was Ira Glaser's.
Yes, and he's absolutely right about that. And this is a distressing sea change in our free speech debate that deserves to be. We need to pause over. It's scandalous that the current ACLU would not support the Nazis' right to march, because that principle of Skokie, far from having to be re-examined, is the cornerstone of our free speech tradition. The idea that, as Justice Holmes said, time has upset many fighting faiths, but protection for the thought we hate is the cornerstone of our First Amendment tradition. There's no reason to re-examine that by any means. And indeed, I was very inspired after we talked, Robert, and you mentioned this willingness to rethink the Skokie standard. I talked to Jonathan Greenblatt, the very thoughtful head of the Anti-Defamation League today. And the Anti-Defamation League remains committed to traditional free speech principles, and they would support the right of the Nazis to march. After the Charlottesville riot, the ADL had an internal debate about whether or not to support the right to march of white supremacists who are actually armed. And there's a plausible debate about whether or not armed protesters form a more imminent threat than those who are not armed. But despite that perfectly reasonable difference of opinion, the ADL today understands that the way to stop white supremacy is actually to go in and talk to FBI agents, follow up on leads, respond to actual threats, and ensure that Jewish people aren't killed because of who they are. And indeed, after recent anti-Semitic events, the ADL does far more work on the law enforcement side in responding to threats to synagogues, ensuring that synagogues can close and protect their threatened populations, rather than the utterly ineffective as well as unconstitutional effort to suppress speech.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, there's more to say about all of this, but I really reject the premise that anything, either technologically or societally, has changed in a way that would make us re-examine the Skokie standard.
I'm getting the impression that while you may have done some rethinking, like Professor Tribe, in the end, your thinking was, no, what I've thought all along is what I think about free speech in the First Amendment.
Well, it's not a question of rethinking and reaffirming existing views. It's as Professor Tribe so well said, all of us are challenged to translate First Amendment values in light of new technologies. And there are many complicated unanswered questions about whether or not we should re-examine the principles or just apply them in new ways. But I have, I remain convinced that the principles themselves should be staunchly defended. And in that sense, there are different things to say about each of the questions on the table. But when it comes to rethinking hate speech, for example, I'm not a fan of revisiting the Barnett standard, which would allow the suppression of group libel, including hateful claims about groups. Just to give a quick reason for that, because the European effort to ban hate speech has been ineffective. The idea that Jewish people, for example, are more secure in the venomously anti-Semitic atmosphere in Europe because Europe allows the banning of Holocaust denial just isn't true. It's a completely ineffective way of responding to race-based hateful speech. And more broadly, we see that the European approach, when it's applied to allow people to ban dignitary offenses online in ill-advised new rights like the European right to be forgotten, lead to the suppression of a lot of truthful speech. In Europe, if we were speaking and someone tweeted that I was being boring or going on too long or wasn't speaking well about the First Amendment, after the show, I could essentially sue and say that this scurrilous speech violated my dignity. And then Google would have to decide whether or not I'm a public figure and whether or not the tweet or the comment was in the public interest. And if they guessed wrong, they'd have to pay up to 2% of their annual income, which, $70 billion. This concentrates the mind, and Google's removed more than 40% of the takedown requests it's received in Europe, including efforts to take down articles about the right to be forgotten itself. So we have because the US is so much of an outlier on free speech, because we defend speech more vigorously than any other country of the world, because we apply that Brandenburg standard that says that truthful speech can only be suppressed if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. We have a very good example of how the other model works in Europe, and it just doesn't work very well.
Jeff Rosen, I want you to stick with us. I'll come back to you, but we actually are being joined by our third panelist, Jelani Cobb. Jelani Cobb, we're taking a break now from the constitutional law scholars. Jelani Cobb is a historian, journalist, and now dean of the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia University. His previous academic post was at the University of Connecticut, where he was an assistant professor of history and director of the Institute for African American Studies. He's known to a larger audience for his contributions to The New Yorker, where he has been a staff writer since 2015. Jelani Cobb, I'm glad you could make it.
Thank you.
And first, does the phenomenon of disinformation circulating very widely and very rapidly change your view of what kind of restraints there should be for purveyors of disinformation, or to put it more bluntly, lies?
Sure. So I think that, what we're dealing with here is a kind of technological evolution that has complicated, these questions. And one example that we might use is you hear people talking about the Second Amendment and, the right to bear arms. And there's a reasonable, I think, substantial argument that the conception of what constituted arms in 1787 as a musket, or the kind of single shot weaponry of the day is so unlike an AR-15, where you have the capacity to fire, an astounding number of projectiles and a really horrifying capacity to end human life, and whether or not that should be protected by that same sort of standard. And so with misinformation and disinformation, we have a kind of analogous situation wherein you can poison the well of public dialogue in a way and misinform people so voluminously that it raises a question as to whether or not that should fall under the traditional ideas we think about as it relates to speech. Particularly as we see kind of automated speech, which is from bots and other entities, where we see kind of misinformation as foreign propaganda operations, and as we saw in the course, most vividly in the course of the pandemic, a way of creating public misperception that has very real public health consequences. What the solutions to that look like, I think no one has quite sorted out. And there have been lots of different ideas kind of bandied about, including thinking of models in terms of how the FCC operates, for instance, and whether or not internet platforms should have a greater degree of responsibility, and whether or not the infamous Section 230, which essentially immunizes social media platforms from the content of what people publish on them, whether or not that should be revised in particular ways. I think that there are lots of those conversations kind of bubbling around in academic and legal and political circles right now. But I don't think that it's outlandish at this point to say that we've reached a place where the technology has presented questions that are so distinct from our previous set of answers that we should begin rethinking how we approach these issues.
You're about to start your first academic year as dean at the journalism school, the J School, as we call it.
Yeah.
Does it all make you rethink how you teach promising young journalists and the things that you,
Yeah, absolutely. So just as a kind of very small scale example of this, the kind of information landscape has been democratized or flattened in particular ways. And it's become more popular. I should say it's become more popular, not necessarily more democratic. As the founders of this country understood, there could be a big distinction between something being popularly supported and something being, so that same thing being democratic. Those two things were not one and the same. And so just one instance in my own experience was that I was reporting, the first time that this kind of arose was when I was reporting in Ferguson. And I tweeted that police, there'd been a local church that allowed protesters and activists from around the country to sleep in their basement, and police had come and removed people, dragged people out of this church basement, and I tweeted that this was going on, and in the midst of this, someone with a larger following count tweeted that nothing I said was true, and that the police, in fact, had not removed anyone from the church. And at that point, it became a toss-up. Who do you believe? And in this kind of flat landscape, it could be that you choose to believe the person who gives the version of the story that you want, that you're most comfortable with. As it happened, I was still on the scene, and I was able to take a picture of the police cars in front of the church. And so that may have bolstered my credibility. But one thing that as that relates to how we educate journalists is that they are working in a vastly more skeptical and distrusting landscape, and in a landscape in which their meticulous, diligent, really thoughtful work can be dismissed in a matter of seconds by bad actors or people acting in bad faith. One of the other things that we are thinking about now at the institution is, being able to verify information that appears to be valid, and how that is an increasingly important skill set for journalists, and so that you don't unwittingly become a megaphone for the amplification of information that's not true yourself. And so if someone gives you a tip or someone sends you a video that purports to show, let's say, Russian soldiers committing war crimes in Ukraine, what are the digital forensics that journalists need to be familiar with in order to make sure that that actually is a video showing what it purports to be showing? And so all of these things, I think, are part of the modern journalistic landscape because they're part of the modern technological and social landscape.
When you talk about being in Ferguson and on one level it being a toss-up as to who was telling the truth about this church, I'm reminded of an optimist 20 years ago, perhaps, looking ahead to the era of the internet as a time which would favor well-known brands. Because since we'd be in exactly the situation you've described, we would see that you were there for the New Yorker, and or if that's whom you were there for, and we could trust you. It would be good for the New York Times and the Washington Post. I think that was a perhaps overly charitable view of human nature and perhaps intellect. I just wanted to ask you one other question before we have our discussion portion here, and that is about you mentioned to me when we spoke last week that the story of Joseph McCarthy, of Senator McCarthy, it returns as a useful template for journalism education these days. Is that do I have that right?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And so, one of the things I think that is important to note is that each demagogue gets the technology of their day. So if you were talking about someone like Father Coughlin and, with his masterful use of radio, or if you were talking about Joseph McCarthy, it was the way in which he had figured out to game the system of newspaper publishing, and making a wildly outlandish claim right before deadline, when people had the fear of being scooped if they didn't run it, but also didn't have time to track down whether or not it was true. Joseph McCarthy shows up on a slow news day and hands you this salacious bit of information. There are all sorts of market and professional incentives to run with that story. And he did that over and over and over again, and to the point at which he was using major American outlets that were supposed to be informing the public. He was using them as a mechanism for misinforming the public. And so what journalism learned in the course of that, as I've told my students many times, that McCarthy would lie exponentially, knowing that journalists could only fact check arithmetically. And so there was this incredible progression or infusion of misinformation into the bloodstream of the nation. And so what publications began doing was effectively fact-checking McCarthy parenthetically within headlines, or making statements that if you're repeating a statement that Joseph McCarthy made, then hedging it with the fact that there's no evidence to bear out that this is actually true. Yeah. And so McCarthy was a kind of precursor or a small scale instance in which media had to become more knowledgeable about the ways in which the system could be used against itself. And so I always think of that as a useful precedent for us to think about in the context that we operate in now.
And I would just add to that, interestingly, that he had his worst days on the new medium of television.
That's right. That's right.
Spreading at that time, and that even though when I attended the journalism school, we worshipped in the church of Edward R. Murrow with Professor Fred Friendly, his former producer. But in fact, Murray Martyr of the Washington Post had done reporting in the previous year that had debunked McCarthy. But as you say, McCarthy could play the newspaper medium, but television proved overwhelming and reaching people of influence in those days, because they were the ones who were much more likely to own television sets. But enough of my McCarthy and media. Jelani Cobb, thanks. Stick with us now. We're not going to let you go now that you're here, because we have another quarter hour with Jeff Rosen and Larry Tribe, who I'd like to bring back, because I want to ask first Laurence Tribe just to comment briefly on what he's heard from the other two speakers. And as soon as we can get Larry Tribe back.
Oh, I'm here.
Oh, you're there. Good. Good to see you. Hi.
I'm here.
Well, you just heard from Jelani Cobb earlier. Jeff Rosen, isn't willing to rethink as much as you are about where we stand right now. What are your reactions to what you've heard?
Well, I think it's a matter of the level of generality at which you're speaking. I don't disagree with much of what Jeff said. I certainly believe in freedom of thought. I believe that anything that would give the government the power through what I described in my initial conversation with you, to establish a commissar of truth and to mediate between ideas and among ideas would be terrible. I have no doubt that freedom of conscience is an enduring. I don't think I need to rethink. Those fundamentals are not the issue. The issue is whether in the environment that I think Jelani Cobb describes so well, we can realize the virtues of those values without paying attention to the way in which new technologies rejuggle everything. As he mentions, there may be bots rather than human beings who are engaged in speech. Jelani's example of the Second Amendment is an intriguing one, because quite apart from the radical difference between the musket and the AR-15, there's the fact that we have weaponized corporate wealth through the First Amendment and through the idea that freedom of speech includes the right to speak through money and spend without limit and to influence the debate in such a way that lawmakers are responsive more to their funders than to their constituents, which results in a world in which 80 or 90% of the people might favor restrictions on weapons of war on the streets of the country, and yet those who supposedly represent them, influenced by corporate funds, protected by, I think, an unrealistic vision of what free speech is about, sort of end up frustratedly not enacting the regulations that people would prefer. So it seems to me that although I don't disagree with the axioms that Jeff describes, I think that making them real rather than celebrating them in a way that sometimes can become platitudinous requires that we focus, as I mentioned earlier, the algorithms that social media platforms use in order to elevate hate speech to the top of the pile. We have to focus, in other words, realistically on the way in which new technologies and the economic architecture through which they propagate themselves affect the ability of free speech to realize its potential. So we can believe in the Enlightenment, we can believe in reason, and I believe in all of them. And I would certainly protect the Nazis marching through Skokie. That doesn't mean that we're going to have a meaningful debate and a meaningful democracy if we pretend that reason will triumph over emotion. We have to realize the way in which modern technology weaponizes emotion. And we have to be realistic, I think, about the regulatory challenges that poses.
Okay, let's turn now to Jeff Rosen, who is, I think, still with us. Jeff, thoughts on what you've heard from your fellow panelists?
So both Professor Tribe and Jelani Cobb powerfully described the challenges of new technologies that lead to the proliferation of deliberate lies and misinformation. And we're all agreed that we need to think creatively as a society about how to respond. And no one is being Panglossian about the seriousness of the challenge. The question on the table, though, is should we rethink our traditional First Amendment axiom that speech cannot be regulated by government unless it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence or lawless action, if it's truthful, and that the false speech is regulated according to existing legal categories. And it's on that score that I'm not willing to abandon the American First Amendment faith. Professor Tribe and I may not, in the end, disagree about much of anything about current doctrine, and it's great that we're both side by side the traditional ACLU faith in letting the Nazis march at Skokie. But what's so significant about this debate is that Professor Tribe and Jelani Cobb are the leading First Amendment thinkers in America. And I think that they speak for not only progressives, but people of all perspectives, conservatives as well, as Justice Alito suggests, that perhaps the old faith should be reexamined as a matter of law. And just to take the example of Justice Alito, he was the lone dissenter, 8-1, in the Supreme Court case that struck down a congressional law banning horrific animal crush videos, a really distressing form of speech. But the court 8-1 upheld it, and Justice Alito would have struck it down because he had more, or rather, Justice Alito would have upheld it because he had more sympathy for the idea that speech that causes dignitary offense may cause real harm. There is in the air a grave, I'll call it grave, but it's also a great impatience with the traditional faith among the younger generation. And we're all sensing that younger people of all perspectives are much more willing to ban hate speech and speech that causes offense than the older generation. And this is the impulse that I want to reject. And I really celebrate the fact that Professor Tribe is right that these are not partisan issues on the court, and issues about whether libel law should be reexamined or tweaked will indeed, as he suggests, divide the court in interesting and unpredictable ways. But I'm just going to continue to make the case that the Holmes and Brandeis faith is the correct one.
Okay. Jelani Cobb, I don't know how much of Larry Tribe and Jeff Rosen you were able to hear, but I would ask you a legal question and then move on to a couple of points from listeners who've sent in questions. I remember as a journalism student, when we learned about libel, we knew which side we were rooting for. Our teacher defended journalists, and we were very happy with the New York Times standard that made it very difficult to sue us for libel. Does that change at all nowadays, or I mean, is it a different attitude toward defamation now?
Well, I think that to several points that Mr. Rosen made, the thing that he mentioned about dividing the court in interesting ways, I think that would be reflective of the interesting divisions that you see around these questions, because there's one thing to say that you support the New York Times v. Sullivan standard, and at the same time, find yourself on the opposite side of this as it relates to Section 230 and technology platforms, social media platforms. And it requires a really high degree of nuance and specificity for us to understand exactly what it is that we're talking about. And the point that I consistently make to my students is that we have a profession that is sanctioned by the Constitution with the implicit understanding that it is a tonic for democracy, that what we are doing is a kind of external check on the natural impulse toward corruption, toward aggregating of power in ways that can become tyrannical, et cetera. And so we have to be able to do that. But the key is kind of understanding a cynical context, because that dispensation has been used in the most cynical ways in order to corrupt democracy itself, or using the machinery of democracy in order to undermine the institution of democracy itself. And so I think that there's that point. One other thing that I'll say that I think should be emphasized about Mr. Rosen's point is the point about creativity. Because I think, dare I say, in this time, we once had a kind of cliche of everyone will agree, and now we can't actually say anything like that anymore. But dare I say that very many people across the political spectrum would be troubled by the idea of a kind of commissar of truth, or government having more capacity to determine what can be said and what can't be said. But also, that's why I mentioned the kind of FCC model and FCC standard that people have been talking about, finding creative ways to incentivize platforms and companies and kind of actors to do something that is beneficial socially. And whether or not that comes from a kind of auspices of government, or whether this is something where government has maybe 30% of the say in this, and then 70% of it is, done in other kinds of ways, and that you have the right to make a statement, you don't necessarily have the right to go viral for that statement. W.E.B. Du Bois talked about in his memoir, as a young person growing up in New England, about how they would have the town hall meeting about whether or not to fund the school for the coming year. And there would always be one person who came down and shouted about the evils of the school system, and education was terrible. And everyone would listen to him politely. And then at the end, everyone except him would vote to reauthorize the school for the coming year. And so I think that there's some analogous way that we have not yet been creative or clever enough to uncover, to translate that into the public world that we're operating in 2022.
Okay, I'd like to put a couple of questions, just quick questions to you from people who've written in. Frederick Garte writes, I'm wondering, I'll put this to Jeff Rosen, I'm wondering whether the founding fathers, he adds sick, because they were not founding mothers in the Constitutional Convention, meant that hate speeches should be protected by the freedom of speech. He writes, by the way, I prefer the European model. It's a more balanced approach. Did Jeff Rosen, was in the Federalist or in the Constitutional Convention, did the framers anticipate true hate speech as being within the limits of freedom of speech?
It's a great question, and the quick answer is no. That there was no consensus about the legal standard for the First Amendment, the old British rule that you were liable for the consequences of your actions. You just couldn't be restrained from publishing in advance, was adopted by many. But Jefferson, who was not at the Constitutional Convention, did articulate the sweeping protection for speech in the Virginia Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom, and Jefferson and Madison in their Virginia and Kentucky resolutions opposing the sedition acts of the Adams administrations articulated a sweeping, majestic vision of speech as a natural and unalienable right, the rights of conscience, which couldn't be controlled under any circumstances. And then Brandeis, when he channeled that in Whitney, did ascribe to the framers this broad protection. He said, those who won our revolution believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government, the deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. And in that gorgeous concurrence, I won't quote the rest of it, but I encourage Frederick and others to check it out. Brandeis says that the framers believed that the best response to evil counsels was good ones, and that's why speech should only be banned if it's intended to and likely to cause imminent violence. So, read at a high level of inspiring abstraction, you could say that the Jefferson and Madison did believe that conscience couldn't be regulated, and therefore that even hateful speech, be regulated. Yeah, had to be protected.
One quick last question is all we have time for, and I'll put this to Jelani Cobb. It's from an anonymous attendee who says, Trump encourages attacks on the press at his rallies and press conferences. What is the right way to respond to that? What would you tell your student? You're at the rally of Donald Trump, and he has singled you out, and people around you are acting bullshit with you.
Well, I think that there are a few things that you do, some of it which you do before you even enter that space, which is to be aware of the possibility of that happening. It also is physically where you locate yourself, how many people you have with you, whether or not for independent journalists this may not be an option, but for other institutions you began seeing them bolstering the amount of security that their reporters had when they were going into these kinds of environments. And so I think that there are all of those things that you kind of bear in mind before you even step into the room. And I also think that our job is to be there to record as dispassionately and accurately as we can the sentiments that are being expressed, even when those sentiments are expressed against us. And so if people are jeering you as a journalist, that should be part of your record as well.
Yeah. Jelani Cobb, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you. I'm glad that we got to you after all. Thanks as well to Jeff Rosen, whom we just heard, and thanks to Laurence Tribe. And many thanks to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, Roni Giuliano, and Adrian Kiss from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and to our technical director, Bobby Grandon. The American Friends of Rabin Medical Center is our program sponsor. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization representing in the United States Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The website of the organization is www.afrmc.org. And please join us next month for Israel's upcoming election with guests Robert Satloff of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and David Horowitz, founding editor of the Times of Israel. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, navigating the new normal. See you next month. Stay healthy, stay safe.